Alrighty, so we're going to pick up right where we left off with the two types of carbohydrates that occur in plants. That's structural and non-structural plants, or non-structural carbs. And keep in mind, our non-structural carbohydrates are the ones that can move throughout the plant and really contribute to the nutritional quality associated with the plant at different seasons. And these type of carbs are going to be used for three major functions, so current growth as well as respiration, reproduction, and storage. So the non-structural carbohydrates are really going to be used for tissue accumulation, so growth, so adding leaf length to our grasses or branch length to our shrubs, or flowering and broadleaf growth to our forbs. And the respiration process is going to be during the dark reactions of the photosynthetic process. In addition, these non-structural carbohydrates are going to be used for reproduction, whether that is producing rhizomes or stolons, as well as seeds in some of our annual plants. And then one of the most important characteristics of non-structural carbohydrates for as a rangeland manager is their ability to store carbohydrates and nutrients for later use. And this really becomes very important when we're talking about our perennial or dormant forage, where a plant is not going to be dead, it's just going to be dormant, but it's going to be storing those non-structural carbohydrates in the root systems, and those carbs are going to be used up as that plant goes through the green up process the following growing season. So in this table, we have two major rows. On the left-hand side is some of the essentials or substrates that are needed for a plant to go through the photosynthesis process. And on the right-hand side is our ability to control those essential substrates. And as you can see, we have no control over the amount of carbon dioxide, sunlight, or temperature that is associated with that plant and facilitating a good growing environment. We have very limited control over water, nutrients, and plant efficiency. And it's very limited because we're not in a heavily managed scenario like irrigated crops would be. So the thing that we have the best control over is the amount of leaf area associated with each individual plant, which contributes to its ability to go through the photosynthesis process. And we control how much leaf area is associated with individual plants by managing stalking rate. So our plants on rangeland have evolved with two major mechanisms that to counterbalance the grazing events, and that is either avoidance or tolerance. So the relative adaptability of our plants, if they have evolved with avoidance mechanisms, is mostly going to be morphological or structural, as well as biochemical, to where the plant is actually producing some sort of chemical that is contributing to its ability to not be grazed. The other type of mechanism is tolerance, and again, these plants develop morphological or structural characteristics or physiological characteristics where they're actually able to grow and combat some of those environmental influences. The reason that we put so much emphasis on avoidance and tolerance really comes from the poor management that happened during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this is a figure from Heitschmidt and Suth from 1991 that shows on the x-axis the grazing intensity. So we have low intensity over here to the left, high intensity to the right. And then on the y-axis, we've got a baseline of 0, and this really dictates plant's production. So we have the ability to increase a plant's production or decrease a plant's production depending on what type of grazing we use. So curve C, the one up here on the top, is representative of an intermediate grazing distribution or intensity. And this allows us as rangeland managers to actually help grasses and grass-like plants grow even more productively if they are grazed at an intermediate intensity. So by actually going through the grazing process, we can allow those plants or help those plants to be more productive. So that is the best type of scenario. Okay. Curves A and B are a little more pessimistic in the fact that if you graze even at low intensities, you're going to decrease the plant's productivity. And we have to be careful with those type of scenarios if we have large populations of very finicky plants or plants that really shouldn't have been established in a certain area. All right, so as we talk about the influence of grazing pressure on grasses, we can split those up into two major categories: heavy grazing and then light to moderate grazing. If we instill or manage with heavy stalking rates, then that is going to decrease the ability of the plant to go through the photosynthesis process because we're utilizing more leaf area. Therefore, there's less surface area for photosynthesis to take place. That in turn is going to decrease carbohydrate production and storage, going to decrease root growth as well as seed production. And finally, grazing heavily or heavy stalking rates is going to decrease the ability of a plant to compete with its neighbors. However, if we decrease in light to moderate grazing distributions, we have the ability to increase photosynthesis, increase tillering, decrease the shade from the neighboring plants, as well as transpiration losses. And all of those things are going to contribute to increased overall growth. Now, keep in mind when it comes to the positive effects that we see with light to moderate grazing, those have to be very, very intensely managed. The more you move towards areas that get minimal precipitation or have very arid environments like the deserts. So some of our rangeland plants have certain types of grazing resistance. For instance, our grasses are going to be the most resistant to grazing. They're going to come back the strongest. Our shrubs are very, very intermediate. And the least resistant to grazing is forbs. Forbs are kind of weak plants, so you have to be really careful with them. So these two major principles, avoidance and tolerance, really have allowed plants to either develop morphological, biochemical, or physiological characteristics that are going to help them to combat grazing pressure. So plants that have or that we call avoiders or have avoidance properties, they're either going to develop structural compounds that are going to allow them to not be grazed very readily, or they're going to produce biochemicals. And those biochemicals you can actually see up here. Those are going to be isoprenones, methanol, as well as some of the terpenes and stuff as well. So those are the avoidance mechanisms. The tolerance mechanisms are also going to be morphological in nature or physiological. So we're going to look at the three main types of plants that we find on rangeland and how grazing resistance really contributes to each type of those plants. So we're first going to start with shrubs. So shrubs have developed either really thick spines or thorns that have decreased their chance of being grazed. So an animal really has to want to eat to get around a lot of those thorns. And then shrubs have also developed secondary compounds in the form of volatile oils that make the whole plant stink or make it really not palatable. So tarweed is a good example of one plant here, although that's a grass, that's not a shrub, but it produces this really thick oil that will ruin any rope that you have. And you see it a lot on the west side of the valley. And so our shrubs can also produce tannins as well as terpenes. And those are just going to be compounds that are going to contribute to the decreased palatability of those shrubs. As far as morphological characteristics, our shrubs are going to have a webbed branch architecture that's going to allow them to not be grazed. So a really great example of this is blackberries. So if we've got some Himalayan blackberries that are pretty invasive in the U.S., and one of the only ways to get those to decrease in production is to graze them intensively with goats. And we're going to talk about this when we get to the animal section, but goats have a smaller mouth and nose set, so they have the ability to actually get into these branches in a greater capacity than cattle do. And then just keep in mind with our shrubs, they're going to most likely be perennial and go through green up and dormancy, but if they hang on to any of their previous year foliage, it's probably not going to be very palatable. Our grasses have developed a couple of different resistance mechanisms. So first of all, they're going to have a high proportion of non-flowering tillers. We're going to see greater delay in the elevation of the apical bud. So our apical buds are going to be the buds that are going to increase the tissue amount. So for example, this node right here or this bud right here is a growth point, so it's meristem. So it's actually creating new growth right here and pushing older growth towards the tip. So when we think about this in terms of grazing resistance, there's a greater chance for this top portion of the plant to be grazed by an animal and then compared to this lower portion. So as long as we don't get rid of those extension areas or those nodes, we can actually increase the ability of those plants to become more productive. In addition, we're going to see sprouting more freely from basal buds, which are going to be closer towards the ground, so they're more protected. And a lot of our grasses, especially in the Midwest, have evolved to have higher ratios of vegetative tillers compared to reproductive tillers. So this means that the vegetative tillers are going to be so massive that the animals are going to eat that first, and it's going to protect the reproductive ones that are actually sending out rhizomes or stolons either above or under the ground. And then finally, our forbs are our weaker rangeland plant. And these forbs have actually evolved to produce large numbers of seed, similar to what we've talked about with star thistle. They have delayed elevation of their growing points, and then they also can produce toxins and chemical compounds that reduce the palatability. So musk thistle or milk thistle is really pretty toxic when consumed by horses in a large amount because that can actually tie up part of their gut. Some of the other poisonous plants that we have are the leafy spurges, as well as the bull thistle or Russian thistle, or the many other names that purple nasty thistle is called. So finally, in terms of how we manage our rangeland plants, there's three major things we need to keep in mind. The first is our primary goal. So our primary goal of grazing management is to maximize the photosynthetic activity of the plant. And we are going to do that by controlling the defoliation that happens to those individual plants. The second major principle is the effects of grazing are really going to be dependent upon four major areas: how intensely we graze, the timing at which we graze, how frequent defoliation takes place, as well as the palatability of the surrounding plants. And then finally, just keep in mind that in order to maintain adequate vegetation residue, we have to work very, very hard to sustain forage production. All right, so that's the end of the plant physiology section, and we will see you guys later.